Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today is a special mailbag episode where we'll answer all the questions from our great listeners. Then we'll turn to a conversation with Sylvie Kauffmann, editorial director, lead writer, and columnist at the French newspaper Le Monde, to discuss France's political turmoil and the future of the Fifth Republic. We hope you enjoy the show. So then, Etienne, let's dive in. We got an email question from Andrew. He said, "Loved the migration episode. More of these, please. Question, which European leader has done the best job handling Trump on camera, behind closed doors, over the phone, etc., to get the outcomes they want while staying in Trump's good graces and minimizing political fallout back home? What's been the secret to their success?" So I think I have mine, but who is your person?
My top pick, since we're interpreting European broadly, I think is Keir Starmer, the British
UK
Prime
counts
Minister.
as Europe.
Depends who you ask. Some UK people say, I went to Europe for vacation. And it's like, well, aren't you also?
So Sir Keir.
Yes. One, because I think he's managed to keep, politically, you would think there could be some misalignment there since, he's center left. But his relationship with Trump seems positive. He's obviously been able to leverage the shine of the royal family, but he's also handled himself in a way that I think maintains that good relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I don't think it's the right answer, though. My one critique would be, I'm not sure how well it's working for him out at home. In part, Nigel Farage is doing very well. I do think there is a British consensus in support of the special relationship. And so if he were to be seen as confronting Trump, I think that would probably help him with the labor base, but might have some blowback from kind of the more center of the political spectrum who want to maintain transatlantic relations. I think it's a tough spot for Starmer.
On that, I agree. The specific part of the question that was about minimizing fallout back home, agreed. Starmer might not be top of the list.
The person I would pick would be Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president. And it's partly because, the guy has a great golf game. I think he really impressed Trump when he went to Mar-a-Lago and they played golf. But here's a country of Finland, a few million people. I think it's 5. The Finns can write in to correct me. But who has really put himself at the same stage or level as, other European leaders from much bigger, more powerful, impactful countries like the UK. And I think he can say that he has sort of thread the needle in convincing Trump that Russia is at fault for invading Ukraine and to not sort of fully undermine Ukrainian sovereignty. There's no real political blowback for him at home. He's the Finnish president. He's not the prime minister. So he's sort of, in some ways, slightly above Finnish politics. And I think Finns sort of look at this and say, oh, wow, you sort of elevated our stature. There is, I think, some fear that he's a little bit like Icarus. He's flying a little too close to the sun. You could get burned.
That sounds like Alexander Stubb.
Yeah.
On a related topic, another listener question we got was around leaders in Europe that have struck a conciliatory approach with Trump, especially, I think, related to trade. And this listener was asking why they are doing that. There was a possibility there would be more pushback from some leaders. I think in some places at home, the population would expect something like this. So why would you say some of these leaders have been more conciliatory, at least publicly?
I think there's a few reasons, and I'd recommend people check out one of our competitors' columns or pieces in Politico. Jeremy Shapiro had a piece basically saying, groveling hasn't really produced results. And I think the challenge here is I think European leaders, number one, sort of defaulted to trying to appeal to Trump to sort of grovel because they didn't quite know what to do. And you could say that this is part of a grand strategy of the Europeans trying to bide their time, trying to minimize disruption caused by Trump, trying to minimize confrontation, playing to his ego. I think there is something that European leaders can point to and say, the groveling, the bending the knee has thus far produced some results. Trump has not blown up transatlantic relations. Support for Ukraine, while not strong, hasn't completely evaporated. And while he is still, he rolled out the red carpet for Putin, he still is not fully given away the store to Russia. I think there's also what you see on the trade side is that, and you saw this with EU trade commissioners being weigh in at a public event after the EU-US trade deal, just admitting and saying, look, we didn't retaliate against the US because of the security considerations that leaders had. And so part of the reason why the EU, quote unquote, bent the knee when it came to the trade agreement and didn't retaliate was because European leaders, at the very least, felt that the security relationship was somewhat on track and worried that if there was going to be a trade war, then that would spill over into the security space, and Europe is not yet ready to defend itself. And we also got a question from Roxana, who asked, how are European leaders dealing with the post-pandemic institutional backlash and the overall feeling of the failure of the system? And that are there any liberal, progressive, or equivalent party leaders in Europe who are undertaking a Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson abundance agenda approach and trying to push that abundance agenda, which is basically calling for
an output-driven politics.
An output-driven politics where it's focused on production, getting stuff done, reducing red tape and costs, and to achieve sort of progressive ends.
I think they're all still trying to figure it out. The far-right parties have just had more success, I think, leveraging the resentment or frustration that still exists in the population, because far-right parties generally tend to gravitate towards simpler messages that focus on grievance and focus on pointing the finger to one main culprit for people's discontent. Center parties want to have a more complex explanation. They also want to balance a lot of different constituencies in that and economic factors, etc. So I don't think many of them have done a very good job. I think they're also reeling from things that were happening before the pandemic to the political spectrum, which is how do we deal with the fourth industrial revolution and the political cleavages that are no longer the same, issues of migration that don't neatly fit into old political separations. So I don't see a ton of parties that do that quite well, at least with like a big picture political proposal.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. The one thing I would sort of maybe quibble with is that I don't think the post-COVID lack of trust experience that we've had here in the United States is necessarily the same in Europe. It's interesting, there's been surveys of trust in the European Union is actually at its highest since, I think, 2005. So the EU has kind of recovered from the trust deficit, and I think came out of COVID in the war in Ukraine looking pretty good. And it's, EU in some ways is trusted more than most national governments. When it comes to the kind of abundance agenda, I mean, I think this is where there is sort of a difference between US and Europe, where part of what Klein and Thompson are pointing to is a lack of effectiveness of American government. That American government oftentimes was seen as putting forward, regulations and paperwork to prevent you from doing things. Some of their critique is both of kind of the left, making it hard to build, but also on the right, where you would create all this paperwork for people to access benefits. In Europe, government seems to be much more, and this is my outsider impression, much more focused on sort of delivering and sort of is more effective at sort of achieving the end results that it is seeking to achieve. What I think we have seen is when it comes to, particularly in response to the energy crisis, a huge shift that is underway in Europe. Countries like Spain are, rapidly deploying solar power all across. And even countries like Hungary, I think the statistic is roughly 40% of their electricity this summer came from solar power. I mean, it's really off the charts because Hungary, landlocked, suddenly it's going to be hard to get natural gas and oil from Russia, solar has really expanded. So I think what we're seeing in Europe is some of this abundance agenda, but I think if there's one individual, I would say, that personifies the kind of abundance agenda, it is Mario Draghi. His report, the Draghi report from last year, is all about basically increasing the capacity of the European market to meet the needs of Europe and to improve the European economy.
Our next question comes from Victor. We're going to shift a little bit towards defense. Victor writes, my question is related to the commonplace in DC that, quote, Europe doesn't spend enough for its own defense, end quote. Factually, that's true. I'm paraphrasing a little bit here. Though it's always seemed to me that Americans don't link this lack of spending to both complete alignment of most European countries to DC's foreign policy and massive sales of American weaponry to Europe, even though Europe helps manufacture some of them. So the question is, do people in Washington, on both sides of the aisle, expect that a Europe that would spend between 2 and 5% of its GDP on defense would use all this expenditure on US weapons. As Max once said, you can't have a Europe that is both autonomous on its defense and aligned to Washington on foreign policy. What do you think?
I think Washington has never had a real coherent approach toward Europe. On the one hand, and this is pre-Trump, this is bipartisan. Pre-Trump, you would hear, Washington hands be like, Europe needs to get its act together on defense. They need to spend more. Why are we still ensuring European security when Europeans are very rich and that Europe sort of does nothing in the world and they need to be more active? That was one point of view that was very present, Democratic, Republican administrations. And then the other view was sort of the NATO priesthood view, which was like, cannot change, will not change. The idea of the EU stepping up or the EU doing anything in defense, bad. We don't like EU spending money on defense because that could mean less weapon sales. So basically status quo, status quo, status quo. And those have been in constant conflict. And so I think the problem is that there is a trade-off, right? If Europe is going to become more autonomous, if they're going to spend more money on defense, well, that's going to tend to go to European weapons producers, particularly at a moment of economic stress like now, where you're trying to sort of apply somewhat military Keynesianism to boost your economies, particularly if you're Germany. And so that's going to be fewer U.S. arms sales. And what we see in the Trump administration right now is wanting Europe to take charge of its own defense, but still wanting all that money to come to the US. It's just not going to. So life is about accepting certain trade-offs. And I think it's very much in US interests for us to embrace Europe being more autonomous. But now we're in a situation where the Trump administration has sort of bought the main point of that, not from me, it's been out there, but that we want to jettison this responsibility, but they're not willing to sort of accept that will come with loss of influence and loss of money for U.S. arms producers.
Yeah, I think that's right. When Victor asked the question, do people in Washington expect, I think a lot of people in Washington didn't think about it until it came up and until American companies came to them and said, well, actually, we have a problem because we would like access to all these new programs that the European Union is going to spend money on to support rearmament. And then they started thinking about it. We have a related question from Wyatt, who talks about NATO particularly and then Ukraine. So Wyatt says, we saw a show of unity with the delegation of European leaders traveling to Washington with Zelensky. That's what you mentioned earlier, Max. Since the NATO summit, how would you grade Europe's efforts to build its defenses and mobilize tangible support for Ukraine? What do Ukraine's allies need to do before year's end, that's 2025, to make sure that they're on the right track?
I think what you see in the rhetoric about Europe, especially in the defense conversation in Europe, is it's always hypercritical. And it makes sense because you never want to be like, look how great we are. We don't really need to do anything more. We solved it. They clearly haven't solved it. There's so much more that needs to be done. And so the instinct is to critique. But if you had gone back a few years ago and said the EU was going to somehow find like 150 billion euros and just sort of conjure that and then say, okay, we're going to have this whole new program so that countries are going to start buying together so we can have more rational European defense capabilities, I think that would have been seen as totally revolutionary. And instead, it seems sort of this like marginal increase, when in fact, it is a revolutionary step. The EU has a defense commissioner. A year ago, they did not have one. And they're getting their nose under the tent of defense in a way that now seems normal. I think this is very impactful. The problem is the pace at which Europe will move and will integrate its defense forces may not match the pace at which they need to, given the threats posed by Russia and the potential U.S. pullback. We will have a report out about this towards the end of the month, early next month, looking at Europe's capability gaps. I think when it comes to Ukraine, they have sort of kept the U.S. engaged somehow. Maybe they had nothing to do with that. I don't know. But the U.S. is still doing weapons deliveries, still providing intel sharing. That, I think, was really in doubt back in February after the Oval Office meeting. This summer, the Europeans agreed to do something that would have been hard for me to imagine them doing a couple years ago, which is they're buying U.S. aid. They agreed with Mark Rutte to go and buy U.S. weapons and provide them to Ukraine. That is just, U.S. weapon sales to Europe and then Europe transferring that onto Ukraine. That's not aid to, the U.S. isn't aiding Ukraine. The U.S. is selling weapons to Europe, but Europe is willing to do that to keep Ukraine in the fight. And so I think that's a huge step because it should mean that the artillery deliveries don't really go down that much. The question is that matching where the battlefield is, and then where US support will be? And the answer is no, yes, but there needs to be more. More needs to be done. I do think the whole focus on a reassurance force was diplomatic signaling back here at Washington. This is the UK-French effort to put troops in to Ukraine if there was ever going to be a ceasefire. I think that's basically signaling by two broke countries that want to always appear that they're leading in Europe militarily, but don't have any money to actually do what is most impactful, which is to provide more military aid to Ukraine. But so I think that has wasted some time, while you would really want to focus leader attention on how do we keep backing Ukraine? How do we send deterrent signals to Russia? And one maybe final thought here as I go on is with the incursions into Poland, with 19 Russian drones going into Poland, other cyber attacks on airports and things like that. This is increasingly is going to be a bilateral competition or confrontation between Europe and Russia, with the United States being very secondary. The US hasn't really come to back up Europe here. So I think this is where that needs to be the focus of conversation amongst European leaders, not some fanciful reassurance force that has almost very low probability of ever deploying. Fine if military officers want to spend a lot of time developing plans, but the leaders that then determine what's going to happen at the EU level and at NATO should probably be focused elsewhere. So that leads to, I think, our final question, which is from Rod, asking about the U.S. as a reliable partner and how the U.S. being seen as less reliable creates challenges for Europe on many fronts: defense, trade, the promotion of human rights, and liberal democracy, all being in sort of uncharted territory. And so what does an EU-NATO response look like? What are the realistic chances of success of the EU and NATO sort of responding to this new world where the US is less present? And what does success look like for Europe if it is forced to step in to fill the void of a values-based global leader? Big question. Donatien, what do you think?
There's a couple pieces to it for me. One is being able to catalyze efforts on the global stage to maintain both open trade and climate-related pursuits these days. That's, I think, for the long term, just really important for sustainability and stability of the international order, to be honest. Ideally, also supporting humanitarian efforts and crisis interventions. I think I've mentioned this in the past a few times, but I actually think, as much as we can debate forever if the EU can have more military force and some deployment troops, whatever, I actually think crisis intervention is where they're really, really good. And that's where they can have a very positive impact in the world, sharing know-how, sharing resources for things like that, at a time where crises just tend to flare up more and more. But that all requires several things at home. One is cleaning of the act on a governance and rule of law side, making sure we don't keep giving concessions to several countries on what's going on at home, on the breakdown of checks and balances and democratic backsliding. That also means corruption. Ideally speaking with close to one voice on key foreign policy issues would be nice. And that obviously relates to all the questions around qualified majority voting on foreign policy. And then being able to agree a budget at the European Union level that matches those ambitions. I'm not sure we're there right now, but to me, that would be what success looks like. It's Brussels giving itself the means to accomplish this level of ambition and not trying to fill the gaps that the US leaves. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. It's more, here are the values that we promote. Here's how we pursue them on the world stage. Let's give ourselves the means to accomplish this. What do you think?
I think sometimes in the US that we like to think that the world revolves around us. And I think we've gotten used to the world sort of revolving around us. But I think what we're starting to see is, I think, a degree of a European sort of grand strategy for the Trump era. It's more of an impressionist painting right now. But what you can see sort of the outlines of is on trade, for instance. We like to think now, okay, the current existing, the world trading order is dead. Rules-based trading system is done, WTO done. But the EU perspective is, okay, 20% of EU trade went to the US, 80% goes to the rest of the world. Let's mitigate the damage from the US. Let's turn to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is thinking the same thing. Oh, we don't really want to turn to China, so let's turn to Europe. There's all this talk of Europe hedging toward China. They didn't do that. And instead, what we're seeing is the EU finalize trade agreements with Mercosur, Mexico. You have India and Indonesia that they're trying to get done by the end of the year, where the EU has made some big compromises. Indonesia, it was like, well, I guess we don't really care about deforestation as much anymore. but we're going to try to just get a deal because Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world. So, those would be big steps. I think the second thing is, as friction starts to emerge in the US economy, is the EU sort of seen as a safe place to park your money? Is the euro seen as a potential rival currency? The EU has to take a lot of steps to actually have more debt to buy, which is one of these great ironies. There's a great paper from Olivier Blanchard and colleagues that point out that actually what Europe should do to make the euro a rival to the dollar is mutualize all its debt and issue more debt. Because in order to challenge the dollar, you have to be able to buy and sell it, and the market's not liquid enough. That's something I think to look for. That's more forward leaning. The second thing I would say on climate and energy, this is where the EU is proceeding apace. There's a narrative out there that, everyone's sort of turning against climate action. I think there's a general turn against climate action politics. But for Europe, they don't really have a choice. They got to proceed with the clean energy transition because they don't have fossil fuels. And you know what other country is doing this because they also don't have fossil fuels is China, which is just putting out a tremendous amount of clean energy and clean technology, both within China and then trying to sell that to the world. And I think that is a major area where on energy and climate, the conversation between Europe and China is going to be key, with the US sort of not present. And countries are paying attention to that. And then maybe the third area is democracy, development, international institutions, which the EU has not turned away from. The EU is by far the largest aid donor in the world. And with the US pulling back, there's perhaps ways that Europe could step up. This new decision by the Trump administration on H-1B visas, which if you're an educated foreign student that had came to the US and then you got hired, this is the path for the United States to basically suck up the global talent pool and have them be here in the United States. Well, Europe could think about trying to do something similar, take some of that talent. And so I think there's going to be a lot of areas when it comes to sucking up talent, upholding international norms, international institutions, providing aid, where the EU will sort of be seen as the kind of standard bearers for the old international order. And in this case, I don't know if old is bad. I think old is what a lot of countries actually like the international system. They either got wealthy or were doing quite well. And I think Europe is going to find itself having a lot of countries turn to it. And I think Brussels is very busy right now with a lot of foreign policy activities. So I don't think that necessarily makes up for the US sort of fully pulling back, if we have fully pulled back. Europe has a vision of the world, and they're looking to defend those interests, maybe not as effectively, as coherently as they could, but they're doing it.
Well, I think it's a great place to leave it, looking towards the future. We are grateful for all the amazing questions that we got. We are thrilled to welcome Sylvie Kauffmann to the Europhile. Sylvie is an editorial director, lead writer, and columnist at the French newspaper Le Monde, for whom she writes a weekly column on global affairs. Previously, she was the first female editor-in-chief of Le Monde, a position she held during the paper's WikiLeaks collaboration with El País, The Guardian, and The New York Times. She is also the author of the book The Blindsided: How Berlin and Paris Cleared the Way for Russia. Sylvie, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So there's been a lot going on in France for the last few weeks. Max and I, in recent episodes, have talked about how there is no such thing as a quiet summer anymore. I think that's true of Paris as well. So let's start by setting the stage, because we have yet another new prime minister in France after François Bayrou resigned recently. So now Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu is in place in Matignon. But he has a lot to get done. Primarily is to pass a budget, I believe, before the end of this calendar year, 2025. So talk to us a little bit about the challenges that are in front of him, given the breakdown of political parties in the parliament and the difficult budget situation that France is facing these days.
Yes, so Sébastien Lecornu is 39 years old. He was until now the Minister of Defense, Ministre des Armées, for the past 3 years actually, which is quite a lot by today's standards in France. And he is a very close ally of Emmanuel Macron. Of course, Macron appointed him, but he's very close to him, which is important at the moment. The challenges are quite impressive for him. He's the 7th prime minister of Macron. So that's quite a lot, but also he's the 4th prime minister in a year. So his main challenge is this political instability, this deep political crisis in which France has plunged for the past year, since actually Macron decided to dissolve the National Assembly in June last year, allegedly to block the rise of the Rassemblement National, the far right, Marine Le Pen's party. But obviously that failed. And instead of blocking the Rassemblement National, what emerged from that snap election after the dissolution was a splintered parliament. So Lecornu doesn't have a majority in parliament, which is why his predecessor, François Bayrou, fell. And his predecessor, Michel Barnier, also fell. So this gives you an idea of the political stalemate and situation where he's facing. On top of this, he's confronted with deep resentment in the French society. There's a feeling of anger and resentment, a feeling of social injustice, which is quite deep in the society. And we saw it in 2 days of protest in September. On September 10 and September 18, there were demonstrations. So the September 10 was organized by the left. So you have this psychological background of resentment in the society and also anger towards the political class, because the elected members of parliament have been and political parties have been totally unable to reach any kind of compromise for the past year. And then one of the main challenges he's facing is the economy, of course, and the budget deficit. France has a budget deficit which is one of the highest in Europe. The whole is around, to give you an idea, the whole is about close to 170 billion euros. And François Bayrou wanted to reduce it by 44 billion, which should have been 5%. And, he failed on this. So we'll have to see what Lecornu can manage.
I want to maybe go back a little bit and talk about Macron and then drill down on this budget question, which is, I think, a real challenge for France. But it seems to me in 2017 that Macron kind of broke French politics, that he saw that there was a real opening in the center and he moved in that direction. And so now seems to be kind of hated by everyone, but loved by very few. Mm-hmm. And I guess the question, are we sort of seeing French politics kind of return to a pre-Macron era with the center left emerging and the left, and then the far right becoming maybe a little bit less far right and maybe a little bit more just right wing? A lot of the machinations that seem to be happening really focused on 2027, the next French presidential election. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about the kind of state of French politics. And is this kind of France preparing for a post-Macron era, and we're just sort of stuck in this kind of stasis period? And we see this actually in Washington a lot. The Republicans in Congress for most of the previous decade really struggled to elect speakers of the House because the far right and the center right could never quite agree. And so the speakers of the House were always quite tenuous. But so maybe you could talk a little bit about the trajectory of French politics. Yeah. Is this sort of the far right inevitably rising, or are we sort of seeing perhaps maybe a return to the center left and the left are kind of reemerging and trying to figure out who's on top?
Yeah, there's a European situation and there's a French situation. So if we talk about the rise of the far right, this is a general trend in Europe. So France is not an exception in that regard. But where France is, the specificity, if I may say, of France and of Macron is that Macron, when he was first elected in 2017, you remember his mantra was neither right nor left, and his intent was to empower the center. And he thought that the center could be a political force by itself. He gathered people from the center right, from the center left. That's how he got elected, right? The problem is he never really bothered to create a political party or to make this electoral force, which got him to power, to transform it into a more permanent political force. His party, which never was a political party, it was a movement, and it changed names. I don't know how many times it's changed names. It was En Marche, and then it became, Renaissance and whatever. So that says something. So what we see now with the polls, he's been in power, so that's in his second term now, so he's been in power for 8 years, is that the far right has also changed names, but not people. It's also added new people, since we have not only Marine Le Pen, but Jordan Bardella, the president of the party, constantly strengthening, and now it's around 30% in the polls. And the center constantly disappearing, in fact. So we now have, at the moment, the National Assembly has 3 blocks, which is why it's impossible to govern. What we are seeing in the polls is the center bloc disappearing. But yeah, in terms of political experience that Macron tried, there was something of a laboratory dimension to it. I think it's failed, basically.
But I'm curious what you make. So Lecornu originally hails from the right. And
Yes.
we don't mean far right, obviously. It's just the
Center
old school
right, yeah.
right, like UMP and now Les Républicains. But there's obviously, it's 2025. We're inching towards the next big election at the presidential level. I feel like there's 2 options here. The Les Républicains could see him as someone who could help pass a budget and a positive actor, but they might also see him as someone who is incredibly close to the president and not want to engage with him at all. Do you think he has the power, given his closeness to the president, or the ability to create coalitions that will pass a budget?
The asset of being close to Macron is that he has this legitimacy, if you want, and also he doesn't have presidential ambition. So he cannot be seen as a rival. But so Lecornu is not, and he's also seen as even though he's a Macronist, he's seen as a very discreet person. He's really definitely not a firebrand. He's not a historical leader. You know, François Bayrou had the weight of being the centrist leader forever, and he always wanted to be prime minister or president. And Lecornu is only 39. He's not overly ambitious. He's a moderate. He comes from the conservative ranks, but he's also been having dinner with Marine Le Pen very discreetly, secretly. But he can also talk to union leaders. So he's seen as a man of dialogue. And the fact that he's not so well known is, I think, plays in his favor. And his record at the head of the Ministry of Defense is quite good. But what he's done so far, which is positive, you know, in the few days since he's been in power, he started by talking to the unions. And that's interesting because this is something that Macron never wanted to do. Macron was seen as the leader, the politician who suppressed what we call the corps intermédiaire, you know, the intermediate institutions. Macron disliked the union leaders as interlocutors. Lecornu takes a different path. He knows that the social situation is tense. He knows that he can find some valuable interlocutors among the union leaders, for instance, the most moderate ones like the CFDT. And he also knows how discredited political leaders are. So he plays this card, and I think this is quite smart at the moment. We'll see where it leads, but I think it's a good initiative. And then he said, after that big day of demonstrations, of protests of September 18, immediately in the evening, he issued a statement. You know, he didn't go on national TV. He issued a written statement saying, I've heard you, I'm open to dialogue. And so he's also made it known that he was ready to make some concessions. For instance, he dropped this proposal that Bayrou had done of suppressing 2 national holidays, which, you know, created a fury in France. So that's an easy concession, actually. But he said he understands this feeling of inequality, of social injustice. But of course, you know, he will not talk only to union leaders. He will also have to talk to political leaders and first and foremost, the Socialist Party, which is really the key player here. You know, it's the swing player because the Socialist group in the National Assembly has 66 seats. And that is really where the fate of the prime minister hangs, because if there is a confidence vote, those 66 votes are key.
And this brings us to the budget crisis or the budget situation you mentioned before. France has an incredibly high budget deficit. What is making this become, wouldn't maybe describe it as a crisis, but of acute concern is that France's borrowing rates are now going up. It's losing some of it's been described as exorbitant privilege within the European Union. I think its borrowing costs are now equivalent roughly to Italy. And it's the political uncertainty here that is really adding to the increasing interest costs. So how does he go forward? Is Lecornu is he gonna adopt some proposals from the left and then, make some concessions to the right? Do you think he can sort of bridge the gap here? And how do you think the political parties are going to treat this? Does the far right want to play ball, or are they trying to push Macron to resign, which, has been their demand? I mean, demand, I think, of the far left as well. So is this going to be sort of a brutal face-off where France is going to be in continued political chaos, or is there a path? I mean, this is the unknown question, but how do you think this is going to progress, and where do you see this playing out? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, so chaos is exactly what Lecornu and Macron, I guess, want to avoid. How will they achieve this? I don't know, of course, what kind of budget he can reach. He will still have to get some spending cuts and new taxes. But he will be, as I said, he will be less ambitious than Bayrou. So Bayrou said he wanted to save 44 billion. So what we hear from Lecornu's entourage is more around 30, 35 billion. But how do you get this? I think, for instance, the left has promoted this Zuckman tax, what we call. There's been a very big debate in France over the past few weeks. Gabriel Zuckman is a Berkeley-trained economist, French economist, and he proposes this to tax what he called the super rich, the super wealthy. So that would be 1,800 families, more or less, in France, and to tax their capital holdings, right? So, of course, the business bosses, the business circles are up in arms against this. Bernard Arnault very strongly criticized Gabriel Zuckman, saying he's a radical left economist. I think Lecornu will not go as far as this, of course, but he will make some concessions on taxing the wealthiest taxpayers in France. So I think he will do something in that regard. Pension reform is, of course, a big problem. He has made it known that he was not going to withdraw the pension reform, but he is ready to make some concessions on the margins, like, for women, for workers who work in very difficult sector, physically demanding, things like that. Now, will he succeed? Can he succeed? It really depends a lot on the Socialist Party. And this, we don't know what's going to happen in those quarters. It's a situation which is really in flux because the socialists have been so challenged by the radical left, by this, whether they should keep their union with Mélenchon or, they're very divided over this. So they are trying to solve this situation, to overcome those divisions. But will they be ready to, make this agreement with Lecornu? It's very difficult to say at this stage. Now, they are not very enthusiastic about, because if Lecornu fails, I don't see, we cannot have another prime minister. And I'm sure Macron is running out of candidates at this stage. So there would be a strong possibility of another dissolution. And this dissolution, a snap election now would have a fairly good chance of bringing the Rassemblement National to Matignon. So does the Socialist Party want to have Jordan Bardella in Matignon? I'm not sure. It's a very tricky situation at the moment. The business circles are becoming, they're a bit desperate. They're completely against this Zuckman tax and this atmosphere of criticizing the super wealthy and so on. So they are trying to build some bridges with Bardella, and Bardella is playing the game, saying, I'm pro-business. The Rassemblement National is really pro-creativity, pro-innovation, pro-freedom, pro-free market, and pro-business. And, a lot of moderate politicians say, be careful, this is not what you're going to get, because behind Bardella is Marine Le Pen, and Marine Le Pen is not, such a free marketer. So this situation is quite moving, unstable, I would say, in flux.
Yeah, the far right's economic position. In the US, we think of the far right or the right wing as being very libertarian, but actually in Europe, it's tended to be very strong protection of the state and of the state's benefits. And so you kind of have this tension. One last political question before I think Etienne's going to ask you about where France is going in the world. Looking ahead to 2027, it feels like to me that there's basically a solid 60% block in France that is basically anti-far right. That what they can agree upon is that they don't want to have a far right president. But the challenge is that in the French political system, the first round of voting, all the parties run, and that's the top two. And what you could see now is a situation where the two candidates that get the most votes, because the vote sort of splinters on the non-far right side, is Marie Le Pen or Jordan Bardella, whoever is the far right candidate, and then Mélenchon or someone from the far left that then becomes the alternative. At that point, I think you could see business saying, well, we'll go with the far right as opposed to the far left.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
that seems to me the pathway for the far right to take power in 2027. And so I guess what strikes me is it seems like the center and the center left kind of need to have a primary and pick one candidate to then emerge. How do you see this sort of playing out over the next 2 years? Is this just, French politics that's going to be, the thing to watch because we're now in kind of unprecedented place for the Fifth Republic?
No, you're absolutely right. The paradox is that I think that we have a social democrat base in the French electorate, but it is not represented anymore by a political party. I mean, the Socialist Party, as I said, is, hesitating. And so we have Raphael Glucksmann, who is a social democrat and a center-left politician, but who is active on the European scene. He's a member of the European Parliament, but he hasn't succeeded in establishing a real popular force in France. And he's also hesitating whether he should ally himself with what is left of the Socialist Party. So we really have a crisis of political representation here, definitely. So there is a space for this, because you're absolutely right. Whether this Front Républicain or Cordon Sanitaire, which has been a fixture of French politics for the past 20, 30 years, whether it will hold at the next presidential election, nobody knows. So there is definitely a space for a moderate center-left social democrat party to be reborn or to be created out of, but do we have the time before the next presidential election? I don't know. I mean, it's fairly urgent now. And you can see some efforts being made, but so far they are not really bringing impressive results, if I may say. Yeah.
It also strikes me that the acrimony between all those center, left, center, right parties is high. That creates very high barriers to any kind of alliance. I mean, things could get worse between now and 2027. That pushes them in that direction. But with the personalities that we see on the board right now,
And this is why voters are so frustrated also. You're absolutely right. Yes, this really feeds the resentment and the anger towards the political class. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to take us a little bit broader outside of France. So one, I think, defining trait of President Macron is that he's always been very active on the international stage, and particularly in Europe. He presented his vision for the European Union very early on in his first term, did it again a few times over the second. But I'm trying to figure out, and hopefully you can help us in doing this, is this domestic situation, which for a while, I think Macron was able to still have a lot of presence on the international stage and credibility on the international stage. Despite the domestic situation, it feels to me like we're reaching a limit in this, especially in Brussels, when France has to basically honor its fiscal commitments and is currently not able to. How do you see the domestic situation impacting France's ability to be a heavyweight, both in Europe and on the international stage at a time where there's so much going on and we need a strong voice coming out of Paris?
I think you have to make a distinction between the political and the economic situation. So the domestic political crisis, I'm afraid I asked the question myself to a political leader of one of our European neighbors recently. I asked him whether Macron was weakened by his domestic travails, and he said, we all have them. So Macron's predicament is not unique. Now, I think the economic situation is more serious and has more impact because, yes, you have a very ambitious government or president on the international scene, but how does he deliver? For instance, he's a leading voice on Ukraine to defend Ukraine. But then where's the beef? How do you deliver all those weapons and armament system that you would like to give Ukraine to defend itself? But, you don't have the means to do it. So this is where I see the biggest impact of France's problem. It's a pity because you can see that, and Macron loves to talk about it, his agenda of strategic autonomy for Europe, which really was not taken seriously when he arrived in 2017. I mean, now it's not only being taken seriously, but some of his partners see it as necessary. So it could be, if he had governed more aptly, he could be much more powerful on the world scene, or at least on the European scene. But, he's trying to make the best of it.
And maybe one final question is, given the kind of budget constraints and the next 2 years, I mean, do you see France continuing to try to play the same sort of role in the world, no matter who is president in 2027, 2028? Is there a degree of continuity in French foreign policy that even if Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella becomes president, that it's basically going to be very similar? I mean, in the U.S., we would have big foreign policy fights. It used to be that the difference between a Republican and Democratic administration would be, really at the margins, maybe consistency when it came to Europe and NATO. I mean, I don't think this is the case any longer. But do you think there'd be a lot of upheaval in where France goes, depending on who wins in its foreign policy? We haven't quite seen that when it comes to Italy, for instance, but I'm curious where you think France is, the role that it will try to play going forward.
Yes, you mentioned Italy, and that's a good example. Some of our partners think that, okay, maybe Marine Le Pen or Bardella, because, Marine Le Pen, it's unlikely that she will be able to run, but I mean, who knows? But it would be like Meloni. I think that's a mistake. I don't see the Rassemblement National going the Meloni's way, And France, I mean, having either Le Pen or Bardella as a French president in 2027, this is something huge. It will be huge. It will be a terrible shock for the EU. France is a nuclear power. France has a permanent seat at the Security Council, whatever you make of the UN today, but it will be earth-shattering, really. I mean, Europe will not be the same at all, and it will definitely not work the way it is working now if France has a far-right president in 2027.
Well, Sylvie Kauffmann, thank you so much for joining us on the Eurofile. The conversation was excellent, and there's a lot to watch for in French politics, at least, in the year ahead and in the years ahead. So thanks so much for being here. That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.